Licensing Committee. As you'll be aware, previous meetings have been curtailed simply through a lack of business. First item on this evening's agenda is the appointment of Vice Chairman. Do we have any nominations? Well, I'd like to nominate from the chair the existing Vice Chairman, Councillor Rosemary Bolton, who has supported the committee superbly over the last couple of years. Do I have a seconder? Thank you. I have two. Tim won by a short head. Thanks, Tim. Do we have any apologies?
Yes, we have apologies from Councillors Reid, Simons, Hall and Wilson.
Thank you very much. There are no announcements. Are there any declarations of interest this evening? No? Good, thank you. Now, as you'll have seen from the papers, we have a raft of minutes to go through because whilst we haven't had full licensing committee meetings, we have had quite a number of licensing subcommittee meetings. So let's take the minutes of the 13th of October 2021, which was the last time this committee met formally. Can we agree those meetings, those minutes as of pages 6 to 14 inclusive? All content? Propose a seconder? Lovely. Rosemary and Jeff, thank you very much. So as I said, whilst we haven't met formally as a licensing committee, all of you have been busy at various times on licensing subcommittees, and I thank you for that. And you can see there on the opening page 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 odd. Can we take them on block? Obviously we didn't attend all of them. You content we take those on block? Councillor Snowden, David Snowden proposing. Seconder? Now's your moment, Jeff. Thank you. Councillor Jones seconding. Good. Okay, well, the substantive business this evening is to consider the licensing annual report, which obviously we haven't done so since October last year. Over to Claire.
Good evening. So I'm going to merge the two reports together because we've got the annual report and the Q1 report. I just wanted to draw your attention to point 3 of the annual report, please. I did note down in the figure of 2020-2021 for the Licensing Act premises visits. I put 0 because on our system, sorry, 128. It'll be 3.1. Okay, so on our system, the premises visits are for what enforcement do as visiting premises. So there were no visits. However, there were actually COVID visits that were being undertaken every weekend by officers. So there were visits being undertaken, but they weren't reported in the same way as a premises visit. So that's just the first thing. So basically from the reports, as you can see, there has been an increase in activity taking place with licensed premises with the taxi trade. That is due to vastly, due to lockdown measures being relaxed. So the premises are trying to recoup the losses that they've had. So they've started to put in more temporary event notices, hold more events, just to try and get their businesses back up and running. We've got 2 live cases that we're working on at the moment, and they were in the annual report, and they're also taken over into Q1, and they're actually now in Q2 as well. They are actually highlighted in the report in regards to complaints that has taken a substantial investigation to kind of get to where we've got to. It's also included PACE interviewing as well, so that does take time to kind of get to a resolution. So obviously the activity increasing then increases the complaints that we receive, so that's why you'll see that there has been more complaints received. And I think where premises were closed, maybe residents experienced a quieter time, so when they started to open up again, that noise was kind of magnified as to what they were experiencing. So myself and my colleague Roz have been dealing quite heavily with a lot of noise complaints where they're potentially breaching licensing conditions. So then we look at those licenses, we look at the conditions, we speak to the premises to see whether we can come to a resolution before we have to take any formal enforcement action. And that's kind of just been the nature of where Q1's led to, and Q2 is pretty similar as well when you get that report. So that's pretty much the report. So unless you've got any questions.
Thank you. I look to the floor. Have we any questions, members? Carolyn?
As regards the licensing premises inspections, you hear a lot of complaints in the town centres in Hertfordshire about the cumulative problems of all the licensed premises in the street, but we never seem to do anything about it. And I don't know whether that comes under the remit of the licensing committee or what. It seems to me it's part of enforcement, but I'm probably wrong. You could just enlighten me. Thank you.
Okay, so when we actually receive complaints, we take a stepped approach. So we start to look at them. As a responsible authority, the licensing authority would be kind of the last resort for any formal action against the premises. So you would look to environmental health or the police. So they would look under crime and disorder or noise disturbance. So generally, any formal action would be taken by those two responsible authorities before ourselves. So it wouldn't necessarily be a subcommittee unless it was called in to review if it was already a current licence. If it was a new licence, obviously that can go forward if there's been any objections. But generally, it would be environmental health or the police that would object or call a review. Does that answer your question?
Yes, except that it never seems to stop, but I don't know why that is. You know, we're getting complaints from Bishop Stortford and from Hertford. Maybe they don't complain officially, but there are a lot of there's a lot of moaning by people who live in the town centre in Hertford, and I do feel for them, to be honest. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, but by all means, anybody, any of your constituents that complain to yourselves, you can direct them to us, to licensing.enforcement, and they can complain to us directly, because without that initial complaint, we're not aware of their issues. So please, by all means, pass them over to us. We are stepping up our licensing sort of out of hours work with the police. We were out on Saturday night in Ware in Hertford. Unfortunately, the weekend that SNT were on, it was a very quiet weekend. Next weekend will probably be busier because it's Halloween, it's payday, that kind of thing. Unfortunately, those officers aren't out next weekend, the team that we work with. So it was very quiet. There were a few issues to address, but whilst we are out as enforcement, we do pick up on issues and we do notice things. So then we can actually take immediate action and be proactive with it rather than waiting for a complaint to come in. So we are stepping up the enforcement approach to the different areas. So it will be the major towns within our district.
David?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just turning to the taxi licence statistics, the ones I'm looking at over from the quarterly report on page 152. I know we've touched on this before, but the number of licences has obviously come down quite significantly over recent years, and especially they slumped during COVID, and they've never really picked up. In fact, they've even come down a bit, sub 200 a couple of times this year. Could you give any more context colour to these numbers? And I may have a follow-up.
Sorry, I'm not really clear on what you mean by more context.
Yeah, perhaps I could. We adopted a policy. I'm not sure it was a year ago. I think it might have been 2 years ago, to keep the level at 200 or thereabouts. And we've really not been under any great pressure to increase that. But that's a policy that this committee settled on. So that's where we're hovering at the moment.
Yeah. The reason I ask that is, as I'm sure Bishop Stortford members will know, there are rising complaints about the lack of availability of taxis. I'm aware that that is a commercial issue as much as anything, but I have had residents asking me to raise this at licensing committee. Whether A, the policy to limit numbers is appropriate, and also whether there's actually anything we can do to encourage more taxi drivers. There may be different issues in different places. For instance, I know Uber is far more accessible in Hertford, whereas in Stortford, you can't get one for love nor money, and we are basically reliant upon what I call the local licensed taxi trade. So just wondering if you had any thoughts on that at all.
Regarding the limitations, as Councillor Andrews said, obviously that was actually, I believe, 3 years backwards. Yeah, the unmet demand survey will actually be re-carried out, I believe, next year, specifically looking at the numbers of taxis. That's obviously not, I understand that's not the answer for the short term, but just for the longer term, just so you was aware of that.
I look at the ranks fairly regularly, not in Bishop Stortford, I have to say, but in Ware and in Hertford. And perhaps if Stortford members could just keep an eye on the ranks, and if they see that they're, there's no cars on there. I mean, that's a two-edged sword, isn't it? It might mean they're very, very busy, or it might mean that they're not turning out to work. Of course, you can't force the drivers to rock up. They will turn up when they think the business is there, and if they think it's quiet, they won't. Claire.
I was just going to say, just from experience, sort of working the district for a number of years, Hertford and Ware, they operate predominantly from taxi ranks. So people have an expectation to go to the rank. They use them in that manner. In Bishop Stortford, from my experience, it seems to be that people would rather be able to ring a licensed vehicle and they turn up to pick them up rather than using the rank space. So you might find that the ranks are empty, but that's because the drivers are waiting in town, because that's how they operate, rather than obviously operating off of a rank. They do operate differently in the different areas in the district.
Yes, I completely agree with that, in that we've only really got one operating rank where you can get a taxi, and that's at the station, whereas the one by Sainsbury's is very sparsely available. But I'd say it's also the calling up or using it via app that, it's not just people contact me. You can barely go on a Facebook page on Bishop Stortford without somebody complaining about the lack of availability of taxis. So it's becoming a more pressing issue.
Can we keep an eye on that? When is the next unmet survey coming forward, Brad? Did you say next year?
It's due next year.
Could you keep an eye on that? Could
Conversation.
Stortford members keep an eye on that and feedback either to Rosemary or myself, and let us know if that's a continuing, and maybe we can bring that forward, or
Yeah.
we can do an exercise in Stortford.
Well, I was about to ask Mr. Chairman if we could actually bring that forward. I believe it is actually a pressing issue in my area. I don't know whether other councillors, Councillor Page, Councillor Townsend, have any other feedback as well.
Is that practical? And by the way, I forgive me, Richard, very, very remiss. I should have welcomed you to the committee at the outset. It's just that actually I was thinking we should introduce ourselves because it's so long since we met formally. But welcome nonetheless. Brad, is that practical to do that on a Bishop Stortford basis?
The actual unmet demand survey, I don't believe it can be done in that smaller area. However, obviously officers can carry out some monitoring to see if we can assist.
So we can't bring forward the whole survey.
I don't think that was the answer. I didn't ask the question. I asked whether we could separate Bishop Stortford. Is a possibility of bringing the survey forward, Brett?
That would be based on budgetary demands. There should be a possibility, but that's not a decision that I can make here today.
Okay, maybe that's a conversation interested parties, myself and Rosemary, can have with officers offline. Jeff.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. Just a query on pavement licenses. I noticed not that many issued. First quarter 21-22 there was 8, and 22-23 there was 3. I find there's confusion with pavement licenses. What exactly, perhaps you can enlighten me exactly what a pavement license is. I assume it's for trading on a section of the pavement. And of course, we have this using parking bays for table and chairs, etc. That is a separate license. That's not a pavement license, is it? And there is confusion. There's confusion with me, and there's confusion, I know, with traders. When you ask them, "Oh, have you paid for your license for your table and chairs out on the street?" And they sort of say, "Oh yeah, I've got that." And of course, it turns out they've got a pavement license, when in fact they're using both areas to trade from. So there is sort of confusion, and I think that obviously the highways ones are handled by HCC, and payment licenses, I assume, are handled by us here. So perhaps a bit more clarity on that.
Yeah, so pavement licenses were brought in specifically for District Council under the Business and Planning Act 2020. There's, as you've just said, there's two types of license. There's the District Council license, and then there's licenses under the Highway Act of 1980 that are dealt with by County Council. What we've found is obviously initially when it was brought in, obviously we had numbers applying, etc. But as it's been extended, people have decided, well, we don't know whether it's going to be extended any further. So they've decided to go and get permanent licenses rather than temporary licenses. So East Herts pavement licenses are temporary. Okay, they'll only now be granted until 30th of September 2023. Okay, where obviously you can get a more robust permanent license under the Highway Act.
And what's the cost for that, Brad?
Well, for us, they're £100. County was about £300 to £400, but I think they decided to be doing them for the same price.
They're doing it for. So, yeah. So I'm right in saying East Herts issue the pavement license and HCC. So you don't do it for, or we don't do it here for on behalf of HCC.
No, it's two separate regimes.
Could we streamline it?
Okay.
It's very confusing.
I hope
It's not just me.
Funny you should say that. There is legislation, basically white papers in force there that is looking at exactly that you've just asked. Can't we just streamline it, bringing it to the District Council permanently? Yeah. But that's currently under consultation, I believe, at this time.
Excellent, thank you. Looking around,
I'm
any
still
other?
confused, but anyway.
Ken?
I think David's point earlier about the taxis, perceived lack of them or reduced numbers, is probably something to do with people using Uber more and more and more, and been putting pressure on the Hackney carriage trade, finding it not so profitable as it was. So that's just something. And of course, the economy, there might be less taxis maybe needed in the future because there might not be the nighttime trade that we've got used to over the last few years. Anyway, my question was going back to this taxi inspections and investigations. The figures we've got were to presumably May 22. That was a significant increase. So it's been quite a lot of time between May and now, and the complaints you talked about, I'll go back to pre-May. So it's been quite a long haul between May and now. So why haven't these outstanding queries been concluded?
The two that I referenced earlier that are still ongoing are actually about premises. They're not about taxis. So any taxi complaint that we've had would have been fully investigated and closed. We've only got current active complaints that would have come in within the last 4 weeks. There's no outstanding taxi complaints that we're dealing with. It was just the 2 premises.
Jim? Jim? Oh, okay, sorry.
On page 137, Gambling Act 2005, I see that there's been a new application for a betting shop, which is very unusual for this area. Could you tell me where it is?
Yeah, sure. It used to be called Morris Charge. It was in Ware. And I believe that one closed. It was our only independent betting shop that we had. And it's now been taken over by Betfred. Yeah, I think it's Betfred. So they would have applied for a new license. And then obviously they can operate. So it's because it's changed hands basically. So that's why that's appeared there.
And on page 138, betting premises licenses seem to have fallen by 1 in September 2021. Can you tell me how that came about?
Sorry, which page? Because I'm not looking at the same document as you. I'm not sure which one you're
Well, I'm
sorry.
looking at page 1, actually probably 139. It says there's a table there of all various licenses. It says betting premises license. Goes from 15 to 14.
Again, it could be the one that closed on our system, because you then say on the system you have to actually put it down as it's been superseded, or it's been suspended, or it's been closed and it's gone. That could be why that number has fallen to 14. I know there's one that's come in, but it could just be the way it's being input into our system, rather than it being that we've lost one, unless you're aware of one that's closed. No.
And with Betfred coming in, I don't think it's illustrated on here, and it may not be the case anyway. But would there have been an application for gaming machine in that betting shop?
I would like to say yes. I don't know if I can clarify that for me.
By applying for a betting shop, that gives automatic entitlements for a number of machines in the premises.
Okay, thank you.
Just the just the normal category machines.
Vice Chairman?
Well, page 134 for us. For you, it's Appendix A, item 3, the premises. It's right at the bottom of page 134. It's about the 2 reviews for premises. It'd be good to have some clarification, please. The first one was a police review. The appeal hearing negotiations resulted. Right, it didn't reach appeal. There was a consent order signed. Could you clarify what that is, please?
May I ask Brad to take this one, because I know that
Yeah,
he was
I can
involved
do
with
take
Wilkstock. I wasn't,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
Okay. So as Claire just said, that was the Wilkstock review of July. Sorry, that was the Wilkstock review of July 21. Obviously, they appealed. However, there was negotiation between both parties, and through legal, a consent order was met, as in conditions were agreed.
So what does that mean?
It means that the license was no longer revoked, but extra conditions were added to the license.
Fine.
So what happened with that one was there was a lot of correspondence between us and Wilkstock's lawyers. We did get independent legal advice on it. And taking into account the cost of the litigation, the cost of the appeal to the council, and their agreement to meet some stringent conditions, meant that the advice that we received was that we should agree to those conditions, which they agreed to offer up, and they agreed to abide by, and those conditions then became part of the licence that was then reinstated.
Could you circulate a link to those conditions to the committee afterwards?
Can do.
Yes, please. And were the police involved then? In that
Police
process?
were not involved in that process, no.
So we don't know what the police view is of that then.
So we, as an authority, had prepared the case to take it right up until appeal, and this settlement was reached literally
On the day.
on the morning, 5 minutes before the appeal hearing was about to start. The judge had read all the paperwork the night before. We were all ready to still proceed with that appeal. And it was at that point that consent order was agreed over that one.
Okay, I understand. Thank you. The second review has been brought by a resident of the Mixer in Ware, that one. And apparently complaints are still coming in from the resident. What's the situation? I mean, does someone turn up every time? What enforcement action is being taken or not taken with that case, please?
Okay, so with the second case, obviously conditions were added to the premises licence. So they would have made up your Annex 3 conditions. So they're operating under that licence. So when we receive the complaints in, we have to look at whether it's ourselves or environmental health, due to the nature of the complaint, who has the most appropriate powers to lead with those. Initially, it was environmental health because they were predominantly noise complaints. So they were about the noise emanating, people outside in the courtyard, or in the sort of alleyway bit at the entrance. So initially they were leading on them. They were looking at options of recording equipment so that they could then prove or disprove a stat nuisance, etc. Unfortunately, the resident wasn't able to support the use of DAT recorders due to personal reasons. So because of that, they weren't able to then prove or disprove stat nuisance. So because the complaints aren't coming in from a license perspective, we haven't been able to identify any breaches of the actual license. So when we do go out and about, we do obviously pick up on the premises that we have had issues with in the past. We just sort of have a little look and see what's going on. And then obviously we will reopen anything if it's necessary to then address it at a later date or take it to the next level with a second warning before we look at formal action.
Okay, thank you very much. That's it from me, Chairman.
Thank you, Tim.
On getting back to Wiltstock, I think you said that advice was received and consent was given. Can you tell me where that advice came from?
That come from our barrister, Sarah Clover.
We'd appointed Barrister Sarah Clover, who's very highly recognised in the licensing field, to give some advice on this. And that advice came from her.
Thank you. I recognise that advice was sought from council, but I must say I'm somewhat surprised that that was the end result, given that members felt that there were no reasonable condition, or rather there were no conditions that could be imposed that would further the licensing objectives. So I am somewhat surprised. This isn't a criticism of officers, but could you just please remind me of the delegations on coming to arrangements with people appealing licensing committee decisions?
Well, ultimately, the decision was referred back to me. And after considerable work with officers, I agreed that the conditions that we had, or they had agreed to accept, were appropriate. Otherwise, we were facing a court case and you just never know what's going to happen in court.
Thank you, Chairman. So, sorry, this is just a process question. So it goes, the appeal comes in, officers work through it, you negotiate with the applicant, appellant, whatever the technical terminology is, then it comes back and it goes to the chairman for a final decision. Is that correct?
Believe in the constitution, it's ultimately it's the head of legal and democratic services together in consultation with the service head of housing and health and then the chairman of licensing committee was consulted.
Thank you.
It's my understanding that the police brought the objections in the first place through health, safety grounds on the running of the whole operation. Surely the police should have been informed and advised whether or not they're happy with the conditions. And if those conditions were accepted by us, we've got to keep a very tight rein. Presumably there haven't been any functions, any events on that Wilkstock site since then. But if there are the next ones, how are we going to make certain that the conditions that we've acquiesced to are going to be fulfilled in its entirety?
I'm not sure we acquiesce to any conditions. We impose conditions. And the situation was that the police would have been called to court as witnesses. They wouldn't have been prosecuting the case. East Herts would have been prosecuting it, and the police would have been there to act as a witness. And it wasn't acquiesced to, we imposed. And as you quite rightly observe, since that time, since the license has been revoked, there have been no other events applied for.
Yes, Chairman, you're right, but I mean, the police were the ones that objected, put
The police
the worries to us.
the
in first
review.
place. Yeah,
The police called the review
Yes.
based on evidence that they had collated.
Yes.
And that's how the review
yes.
was determined.
It's a shame that the PR from the other side is that they've had a major victory and we've wasted their time. So just be aware of the PR that's coming out of this.
No, just that the conditions that were agreed were quite stringent. And we, as an authority, we didn't back down very quickly on that. We did, you know, the events have been limited in terms of the numbers that they can have. The times have been minimised. So the conditions that are there are quite stringent. And ultimately that was our stance on it. You know, licensable activities can only take place between May and September now, during the brighter months, which alleviated some of the concerns that were raised by the police. So all in all, the police would have been a witness at on appeal.
Yes, and my original point was, how are we going to make sure that they're vigorously monitored on their next operation? Make certain there isn't a horrible injury or fatality.
Once, obviously, we are notified of the next event, obviously, licensing will be working with both the police and environmental health in enforcement.
And I'd just like to repeat, we did not acquiesce. We drove the process all the way through, literally to the morning of the hearing. And officers were extremely active in that process. And it's highly unusual. It doesn't happen here very often. That's the first one we've really taken to that stage. It's most unusual. And clearly the conditions that we've put in place mean that they've not been able to hold an event within those conditions since then because of the probably because of the nature of the seasons. Rosemary.
As you've already asked, it would be good to have the link to and see those conditions, please. I would urge that the process on overseeing it happens early, because as we've known from, there've been several hearings with this applicant, their event management plan was not effective or timely or satisfactory in many ways for both our officers or the police. So that is a good time to start picking up whether they really are complying or not. Those.
And that
Yeah,
point has been picked up in the conditions that have been agreed.
Yeah, absolutely. The concerns of the licensing committee and the subcommittee have been definitely built in and into those conditions. Looking around, can I ask a few questions? Firstly, if we go to page 133 of the papers, there's mention there of an individual trying to bypass the English test by cheating, and without going into details, could you tell us a little bit more about how we discovered that and what was done about it?
Yes, so the system we use actually records the driver while they're completing the test. That's both audio and visual. That is then verified by an officer for basically when the results given. It's also got a little bit of AI intelligence in there, in that it actually also notifies us if it believes there has been any cheating carried out. On reviewing back that particular video, the driver was there with his colleague, and his colleague was whispering, but it was not very quiet, shall we say, and clearly audible and clearly cheating. As such, the appropriate action was taken.
Again, that's something that ultimately came back to me, and I looked at the evidence quite closely, and it was very convincing. But I think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, officers are working with this, and that all of these new tests come out as a result of guidelines that come from the Department of Transport.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. Sticking with taxis, could you tell us just a little bit about what a taxi inspection involves and where it takes place?
Okay, a lot of our taxi inspections take place at the roadside. And what we would be looking for is defective tyres. We would look at window wipers, basically defective of the vehicle that would maybe cause the customers to be at harm. We also check for the standard taxi stuff. So we look for fire extinguishers, first aid kits, that the drivers are wearing their badges so they can be identified, that their plates are on the rear of the vehicle. We look at the bodywork of the vehicle to make sure there's no sharp edges or they've had an accident and it looks like a tip on wheels. So we look for the standard that we require, and that's kind of what we do for the inspections. Sometimes we do go out with the police because as officers we don't have the authority to stop a vehicle, so it might be that you see one drive past you, but if you're with the police officers they can actually blues and twos, they can stop the vehicle, we can then do an inspection. So we do work quite closely with the SMT team for that purpose. And I'm currently at the moment working with the new sergeant, and I'm looking to set up a taxi operation later this year, which will be a bigger operation, which we have done in the past with a Wickes takeover. So we actually take over Wickes car park in Hertford, and officers go out in town, and they basically give them like a ticket to say present your vehicle at Wickes car park, and then we're hoping to get traffic there as well, so there'll be traffic officers, there'll be ourselves, the police officers, so that's something that I'm currently working on at the moment.
How about checking? I mean, I'm conscious of the fact that as life is getting much more expensive lately, there's always a temptation for individuals to short circuit the system. And one of the big expenses associated with being a taxi driver is the hire and reward insurance, which is inordinately expensive. How are you keeping a check on the fact that they've got that? Because they can buy it daily or weekly. And clearly that's an important factor.
Okay, so if it's just ourselves out on the road, well, ourselves doing it, obviously we can only ask to see the certificate. If we are with the police, etc., they can run, well, they run their checks, both on driver license and whether the vehicle is holding the appropriate insurance, MOT, etc.
Yes, I think the MOT is less of a problem, but with the extraordinary expense of our hire and reward, there must definitely be an opportunity for drivers to save a considerable amount of money, many hundreds of pounds a month, and that's a significant amount. Is that the most sophisticated way we've got of checking whether or not they're properly insured? I'm not talking about insurance of the car itself. Hire and reward is above and beyond that. It's an applique across the top. So the vehicle itself would be insured for normal use, but it's the hire and reward element that I'm concerned with.
As a local authority, it is only the police that will have, it will only be the police that will have powers to actually physically check live data.
If I could just ask a question from a point of current ignorance, when it refers to dual drivers, is that for dual control or multiple drivers on a single license?
That's a driver that holds both a license to drive both private hire vehicles and Hackney carriage vehicles.
Right, thank you very much.
They're in the wrong ear. I have been advised that we should accept item 7 and item 8 separately. So would one of you be kind enough to propose we accept item 7? Councillor Snowden, Ken Croft has seconded, and item 8. Oh, we have to vote.
Thank you.
And I'm looking for a proposer seconder for number 8, the review of licensing activity. Proposed Carolyn, seconded Jeff. Okay. Never fall the wrong side of democratic services. So it just remains me once again to welcome Richard to us. This is his first meeting with the licensing committee. There is no urgent business. So before I close the meeting, and you. Are you new too? No, you've been here years. Yes. You got time off for good behaviour. So no urgent business. So in closing, just to thank Claire for the report, thank Rosalind, thank Brad for his hard work, beavering away in the background at all times, and Dimple for the excellent support she gives us when we have our licensing subcommittee meetings. And of course, democratic services in it. So that's the end of the